The Hoodlum Circus and the Statutory Rape of Bass Lake. 9. How did the angels grow to be such disliked hellraisers? The answer is that it wasn't easy. They worked overtime at being crafty, cruel, and cowardly. True Detective Magazine, August 1965. I went through all that school and family jazz. It's all crap. Boy, am I glad the angels took me in. I don't ever want to be anything but an angel, and that's it. Replied to a question. By midsummer of 1965, the Hells Angels were already the subject of at least 2 scholarly theses, and no doubt there were others in the works. Yet all over California, there were people whose real or imagined dealings with outlaw motorcyclists had been much too personal to allow for any abstract sociological perspective on the menace. For everyone who'd ever seen a Hell's Angel in the flesh, there were half a dozen more who'd been frightened silly by the whooping of the news media. So it came as no surprise when a certain amount of public tension built up as the 4th of July approached. On the Friday night before the 4th, I called the box shop. I'd never been on a holiday run, and since this one had the markings of a real boomer, I decided to go along. Frenchie wanted to make sure I wasn't planning to bring anyone with me before he confirmed the site. Yeah, it's Bass Lake, he said. About 200 miles east from here. I'm a little worried about going. There might be trouble. We're hoping we can just get together and have a good time. But with all this publicity, I'm afraid every cop in the state will be there. There was good reason to expect a police presence. The press had been sounding the alarm for weeks. On June 25th, a United Press International Bulletin out of Los Angeles said, "Cops worry about Hell's Angels July 4th breakout." It quoted Attorney General Lynch to the effect that his office had received various reports on what the Hells Angels had in mind for their annual midsummer picnic. One of these reports stemmed from the futile attempt to sell coverage of a July 4th rumble to the New York Times and other interested parties. The rumble rumor spread quickly and even got a plug on NBC's Monitor newscasts from New York. Then in late June, a motorcycle riot in Lasonia, New Hampshire, made the front page news all over the nation. The California press gave it prominent play because the mayor of Lasonia blamed the whole thing on the Hells Angels. The July 2nd issue of Life carried a big Laconia story with pictures of a burning car, National Guardsmen with fixed bayonets, and a collection of confiscated weapons, including hatchets, crowbars, machetes, brass knuckles, chains, and bullwhips. Some 15,000 motorcyclists were said to have run wild in the little New England resort, battling police and setting fire to various buildings, while the Hells Angels egged them on. The warning to California was clear. If a handful of Hells Angels could cause that much trouble 3,000 miles from home, it was dreadful to contemplate that the whole clan might do it in their own West Coast backyard. Bass Lake is a tiny resort near Yosemite National Park in the Sierra Nevada. The Angels made a half-hearted attempt to keep the destination a secret, but the vanity of the many swamped the discretion of the few. And once the word leaked out, there was no stopping it. The police got the fix from unnamed sources. The press picked it up from the police, and by the time it reached the airwaves, it sounded like an Orson Welles radio drama. Early newscasts on Saturday, July 3rd, gave the impression that the citizens of Bass Lake were about to make a last-ditch stand against hopeless odds in a fate too vile for description. But not even the radio newscasters seemed certain of the outlaw's destination. They were careful to attribute their information to police reports, which also said, according to the newspapers that morning, that the Hells Angels were expected to strike just about everywhere between Tijuana and the Oregon state line. The Los Angeles Times speculated that nearby Malibu Beach might be the scene of a latter-day version of the Wild One, but this time with real blood and without Marlon Brando. The San Francisco Examiner reported a Hells Angels plot to terrorize the annual Lions Club bean feed in suburban Martin County, just north of the Golden Gate. And the Chronicle uncovered a heart-wrenching Hells Angels plan to bust up a charity benefit for the Guide Dogs for the Blind, also in Martin County. Hells Angels massing. At least a dozen communities all over the state were said to be braced for invasion. It added real zest to the holiday atmosphere. Here were all these weekend mountaineers, solid 9-to-5 types with a yen to cut loose, bugging off for distant campsites with cars full of hot dogs and charcoal and badminton rackets, and all of them wondering if they would get through the weekend without being traumatized or chain whipped. Prior to the Bass Lake run, all the outlaws' publicity had been after the fact, lurid tales from police blotters, victims, and bystanders. Now, for the first time, it was possible to actually attend a Hells Angels rally. All you had to do was sift through the grab bag of rumors and choose the right location. The California Highway Patrol had announced the existence of a new and elaborate tracking network, a radio communications system designed to pinpoint and gather any gathering of motorcycle outlaws and broadcast their movements to police all over the state so that no community would be taken by surprise. But there was no announcement of any plans to neutralize the threat. A widespread misapprehension about the Hells Angels is that they are prima facie illegal, and that every one of their potentially explosive runs could be nipped in the bud by simply arresting the whole gang the moment they appeared on the highway. This would set up an interesting legal situation for the arresting officers. Would be hard-pressed to find a valid charge to book them on. There's nothing illegal about riding a motorcycle from one town to another. 1,000 Hells Angels could ride from New York to Los Angeles without risking arrest, until they violated at least one law or local statute. The Angels are well aware of this, and before setting out on a run, they go over their route on a map and exchange information about what towns along the way might be dangerous because of abnormally tight speed limits, lack of signs, unusual laws, or anything else that could get them hung up. Most have been riding motorcycles all over California for years, and they know from experience which towns are likely to be unfriendly. About 30 miles south of San Francisco, for instance, is a village called Half Moon Bay, where motorcycle outlaws are arrested on sight. The Angels know this and try to avoid the place. If they wanted to make an issue of such an obvious harassment policy, they could almost certainly get any arrest thrown out of court. But to do that would take time and money, and Half Moon Bay isn't that important to them. It isn't much of a party town. Reno is in a different category. For many years, the Angels made their July 4th run to Reno, but after a dozen Angels destroyed a tavern in 1960, the biggest little city in the world passed a law making it illegal for more than 2 motorcyclists to ride together inside the city limits. There are no signs proclaiming this along the many approaches to town, and the law would surely be knocked down in court if a trio of touring cyclists from the east was ever clapped in jail for simply riding together through the city. But that isn't likely. The law was designed to give Reno police a legal weapon against the Hells Angels. And even the Angels could probably beat it in court if any one of them were willing to, 1, spend a holiday weekend in jail, 2, post a minimum of $100 in bail money, 3, return to Reno several weeks later with a lawyer to plead not guilty and be advised of a trial date, 4, make another trip to Reno, again with a lawyer to argue the case in court, and 5, in all likelihood, return for a third appearance in either Reno or nearby Carson City to appeal the conviction in a higher court. And 6, come up with enough money to pay a lawyer for the time and effort it would take to prepare a brief with enough impact to convince a Nevada state court that one of Reno's local statutes is unconstitutional, irrational, and discriminatory. Justice is not cheap in this country, and people who insist on it are usually either desperate or possessed by some private determination bordering on monomania. The Hells Angels are not of this persuasion, not even when it means giving up the pleasures of Reno. They try to avoid places where the odds are stacked against them, legally or otherwise, and they are usually pretty shrewd about knowing what the odds really are. Runs are primarily parties, not war games, and small town jails are dull. Consider the alternatives available to a chief of police in a remote town of 20,000, with a police force of 25 men. When he gets word that anywhere from 300 to 500 motorcycle outlaws are due to converge on him in a matter of hours. The worst thing he's had to contend with in 9 years was a bank holdup involving an exchange of a dozen shots with 2 hoods from Los Angeles. And that was a long time ago. And since then his job has been placid. Highway accidents, teenage rowdies, and weekend drunk fights in some of the local bars. Nothing in his experience has prepared him to face an army of half-human hoodlums, a modern-day James gang, infamous thugs, who would just as soon stomp on a cop, as they would on a toad. And once they get out of hand, the only way to handle them is with brute force. Even if he has emergency legal powers and a jail big enough to hold them all, there is still the problem of forcing them into submission. 2 of his men are sick, 2 are on vacation, so that leaves 21. He jots down some figures on a desk pad. 21 men, each with a pump-action shotgun, 5 shots, and a revolver, 6 shots, gives him an outside chance in a carefully staged ambush of taking out 200 of the enemy, leaving hundreds more suddenly gone wild with fear and rage. They could do incredible damage, and an ambush is out of the question anyway because of the nightmarish publicity. What would the governor of the nation's most progressive state have to say about the deliberate massacre of 200 citizens by a backwoods police force on Independence Day? The alternative is to let the outlaws enter the town and try to keep them under control, at least until they start something. But that might lead to a close-quarters struggle without warning. The enemy would have time to get doped up and drunk, time to unlimber his weaponry and choose his terrain. With an all-night effort, some 50 or 75 reinforcements might be rallied from neighboring towns and counties. But on a holiday weekend, no police force has many men to spare, and even these would be subject to instant recall in case the outlaw pack suddenly veered off course and stopped for a beer break at some unexpected place. The whole battle plan would have to be changed on the spur of the moment. The Angels have never fought a pitched battle with the forces of law and order, and they have attacked individual cops, or as many as 3 and 4, so often that police in most towns either treat them gently or confront them with as much force as possible. The outlaws don't share the middle-class respect for authority and have no reverence for the badge. They measure a cop's authority by his power to enforce it. Some of the stories from the original Hollister fracas in 1947 tell of local police being locked in their own jail by rampaging cyclists who then took over the town. But the only Hells Angel now riding who was actually present at Hollister discounts most of the tales that have grown up over the years. "We were just there for a party," he explains. "As far as punching on the citizens and stuff like that, we didn't do it. Sure, we made a lot of noise, and we chased some people who started throwing rocks at us. When the cops got panicky, we put a couple of them in garbage cans and stacked their bikes on top of them, that's all." In 1948, a year after Hollister, 1,000 or so motorcyclists had a party in Riverside, near Los Angeles. They raced through the streets, hurled firecrackers at the cops, and generally terrorized the citizenry. One grinning pack halted the car of an Air Force officer in the middle of town. When the airman honked his horn, the cyclists jumped on the hood of his car and caved it in, smashed every window, slugged the driver, and pawed his terror-stricken wife before letting them go with a warning not to honk at pedestrians. Sheriff Kerry Rayburn cornered one bunch of invaders and ordered them out of town, but they contemptuously slapped him around, ripped off his badge, and tore his uniform. When the sheriff called for reinforcements, the outlaws fled. Long before the era of mutual assistance pacts between neighboring police forces, the embryo wild ones had better sense than to fight seriously with armed cops. Even now, they will only challenge police if the situation obviously calls for restraint on the part of the law. A riot in the making, a roust in front of TV cameras, or any confrontation that draws a crowd and makes shooting out of the question. Because of this, a pack of Hells Angels on a run to a resort area is a hellish thing for rural cops to deal with. The trick is to control them without any provocation, but outlaws are very easily provoked. Once a showdown gets out of control, there are bound to be injuries, bad publicity, and the chance of a career-tarnishing reprimand for any cop who loses his head and takes extreme measures, like shooting into a melee and hitting the wrong person. American law enforcement procedures have never been designed to control large groups of citizens in rebellion, but to protect the social structure against specifically criminal acts or persons. The underlying assumption has always been that the police and the citizenry form a natural alliance against evil and dangerous crooks, who should certainly be arrested on sight and shot if they resist. There are indications, however, that this natural alliance might be going the way of the Maginot Line. More and more often, the police are finding themselves in conflict with whole blocks of the citizenry, none of them criminals in the traditional sense of the word, but many as potentially dangerous to the police as any armed felon. This is particularly true in situations involving groups of Negroes and teenagers. The Watts riot in Los Angeles in 1965 was a classic example of the new alignment. The whole community turned on the police with such a vengeance that the National Guard had to be called in. Yet few of the rioters were criminals, at least not until the riot began. It may be that America is developing a whole new category of essentially social criminals, persons who threaten the police and the traditional social structure, even when they are breaking no law, because they view the law with contempt and the police with distrust, and this abiding resentment can explode without warning at the slightest provocation. Some of the Hells Angels' more spectacular crimes are technically misdemeanors, such as lewd and lascivious behavior, disturbing the peace, and disturbing the peace. These are routine offenses, generally appearing on police blotters as vague lewd. Thousands of people are booked every year for obscenity in public places, for fighting in bars, and racing vehicles in populous areas. But when 500 delegates from some apparently subhuman species converge on a peaceful community and begin pissing in the streets, hurling beer cans at each other, and racing loud motorcycles around the village square, the shock effect on the citizenry is more severe than a Dillinger-style machine gun assault on the local bank, which is, after all, insured. Few men will break down and weep at the prospect of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation having to pay off a claim. But reports of 100 filthy thugs en route to a mountain resort can throw the whole population into armed panic. This was the situation on July 3rd, 1965. Base Lake had been tense for days. Copies of the July 2nd Life featuring Laconia were prominently displayed on racks at the village markets. The locals were expecting the worst, judging from all the publicity. The most optimistic forecast called for drunken brawling and property damage, civic fear, and possible injury at any moment. It was also probable that the outlaws would buy up the town's entire beer supply, as is their wont. And if the brutes lived up to their reputation, there was every reason to expect a holocaust of arson, looting, and rape. As the weekend began, the atmosphere at Bass Lake was reminiscent of a Kansas hamlet preparing for a tornado. Chapter 10. Man, when you were 15 or 16 years old, did you ever think you'd end up as a Hells Angel? How did I get screwed up with you guys anyway? Christ, I got out of the Army and came back to Richmond, started riding a bike around, wearing my chinos and clean sports shirts, even a crash helmet. And then I met you guys. I started getting grubbier and grubbier, dirtier and dirtier. I couldn't believe it. Then I lost my job. Started spending all my time either going on a run or getting ready for one. Christ, I still can't believe it. Fat D, a Richmond Hells Angel. What do you mean by the word right? The only thing we're concerned about is what's right for us. We got our own definitions of right. A Hells Angel sunk in philosophy. According to Frenchie, the run would take off at 8 a.m. from the El Adobe, a tavern on East 14th Street in Oakland. Until the autumn of 1965, the El Adobe was the unofficial headquarters of the Oakland chapter and a focal point for all Hells Angels activity in Northern California. But in October, it was demolished to make way for a parking lot, and the Angels moved back to the Sinners Club. Early weather forecasts said the whole state would be blazing hot that day, but dawn in San Francisco was typically foggy. I overslept, and in the rush to get moving, I forgot my camera. There was no time for breakfast, but I ate a peanut butter sandwich while loading the car. Sleeping bag and beer cooler in back, tape recorder in front, and under the driver's seat, an unloaded Luger. I kept the clip in my pocket, thinking it might be useful if things got out of hand. Press cards are nice things to have, but in riot situations, a pistol is the best kind of safe conduct pass. By the time I left my apartment, it was almost 8, and somewhere on the fog-shrouded Bay Bridge between San Francisco and Oakland, I heard the first radio bulletin. The Sierra community of Bass Lake is bracing this morning for a reported invasion of the notorious Hells Angels motorcycle gang. Heavily armed police and sheriff's deputies are stationed on all roads leading to Bass Lake. Madera County Sheriff Marlon Young reports helicopters and other emergency forces standing by. Neighboring law enforcement agencies, including the Kern County Sheriff's Canine Patrol, have been alerted and are ready to move. Recent reports say the Hells Angels are massing in Oakland and San Bernardino. Stay tuned for further details. Among those who made a point of staying tuned that morning were several thousand unarmed taxpayers en route to spend the holiday in the vicinity of Base Lake and Yosemite. They had just got underway, most of them still irritable and sleepy from last-minute packing and hurrying the children through breakfast, when their car radios crackled a warning that they were headed right into the vortex of what might soon be a combat zone. They had read about Laconia and other Hells Angels outbursts, but in print, the menace had always seemed distant, terrifying to be sure, and real in its way, but with none of that sour stomach fright that comes from the realization that this time it's you. Tomorrow's newspapers won't be talking about people being beaten and terrorized 3,000 miles away, but right exactly where you and your family are planning to spend the weekend. The Hells Angels. Blood, gang rape. Glance over at your wife, your children in the back seat. Could you protect them against a gang of young toughs gone wild on booze and drugs? Remember those pictures? Big, ugly street fighters, not even afraid of police, loving a fight, swinging chains and big wrenches, knives, no mercy at all. The bridge was crowded with vacationers, getting an early start. I was running late by 20 or 30 minutes, and when I got to the toll plaza at the Oakland end of the bridge, I asked the gatekeeper if any Hells Angels had passed through before me. The dirty son of a bitches are right over there, he said, with a wave of his hand. I didn't know what he was talking about until I came 200 yards past the gate, when I suddenly passed a large cluster of people and motorcycles grouped around a gray pickup truck with a swastika painted on the side. They seemed to materialize out of the fog, and the sight was having a bad effect on traffic. There are 17 eastbound toll gates on the bridge, and traffic coming out of them is funneled into only 3 exits, with everyone scrambling for position in a short, high-speed run between the toll plaza and the traffic dividers, about a half mile away. This stench is hazardous on a clear afternoon, but in the fog of a holiday morning, with a dread spectacle suddenly looming beside the road, the scramble was worse than usual. Horns sounded all around me as cars swerved and slowed down. Heads snapped to the right. It was the same kind of traffic disruption that occurs occurs near a serious accident. And many a driver went off on the wrong ramp that morning, after staring too long at the monster rally that, if he'd been listening to his radio, he'd been warned about just moments before. And now here it was, in the stinking, tattooed flesh, the menace. I was close enough to recognize the gypsy jokers, about 20 of them, milling around the truck while they waited for late-running stragglers. They were paying no attention to the traffic, but their appearance alone was enough to give anyone pause. Except for the colors, they looked exactly like any band of Hells Angels. Long hair, beards, black sleeveless vests, and the inevitable low-slung motorcycles, many with sleeping bags lashed to the handlebars, and girls sitting lazily on the little pillion seats. It was 8:15 when I got to the El Adobe. The parking lot was full of bikes. I'd stopped at a diner in downtown Oakland to fill my canteen with coffee and to let the outlaws get mustard. It was the gypsy jokers who made up the bulk of the crowd in the El Adobe parking lot when I arrived. A group of 50 or 60 angels had already left for Bass Lake. I introduced myself and drew a dead blank. Word had gone out that this was going to be a head-knocking run anyway, and the idea of having a rider in tow didn't groove anybody, which was understandable, but I hadn't asked the jokers if I'd be welcome on the run in the first place, and I didn't expect them to bother me if they thought I was with the angels. Buck, a huge Indian on a purple Harley, told me later that they'd pegged me for a cop. The hostility was obvious but muted. I decided to stay with the Jokers until they got underway, then try to catch up with the others. They were running a few minutes ahead, and I knew they'd be holding to the speed limit. A handful of angels trying to catch up with a run will often whale through traffic at 85 or 90, using all 3 lanes of the freeway, or running straight down the center line if there is no way to pass. Because they know all the cops are up ahead, watching the big formation. But when the outlaws move in a mass, under the watchful eye of the highway patrol, they maintain a legal pace that would do pride to a U.S. Army convoy. For most of the year, the Hells Angels are pretty quiet. Around home, on their own turf, they cultivate a kind of forced coexistence with the local police. But on almost any summer weekend, one of the half-dozen chapters might decide to roam on its own, 20 or 30 strong, booming along the roads to some small town with a token police force to descend like a gang of pirates on some hapless tavern owner whose only solace is a soaring beer profit that might be wiped out at any moment by the violent destruction of his premises. With luck, he'll get off with nothing more than a few fights, broken glasses, or a loud and public sex rally involving anything from indecent exposure to a gangbang in one of the booths. These independent forays often make news, but it is on their 2 major runs, Labor Day and the 4th, that the hell and headlines break loose. At least twice a year, outlaws from all parts of the state gather somewhere in California for a king-size brain bender. A run is a lot of things to the Angels. A party, an exhibition, an exercise in solidarity. You never know how many angels there are until you go on a big run, says Zorro. Some get snuffed, some drop out, some go to the slammer, and there's always new guys who've joined. That's why the runs are important. You find out who's on your side. It takes a strong leader like Barger to maintain the discipline necessary to get a large group of Hells Angels to the run's destination. Trouble can break out almost anywhere. The Angels won't admit it, but one of the main kicks they get on a run comes from spooking and jangling citizens along the way. They'd have no problem getting from the Bay Area to Bass Lake if they wanted to travel incognito, dressed like other weekenders, and riding in Fords or Chevrolets. But this is out of the question. They wear their party clothes, making themselves as conspicuous as possible. People are already down on us because we're Hells Angels, Zorro explained. This is why we'd like to blow their minds. It's just more or less burns them, that's all. They hate anything that's not right for their way of living. Anybody who has ever seen the Angels on a run will agree that rural Californians are likely to reject the spectacle as not right for their way of living. Anybody who has ever seen the Angels on a run will agree that not right for their way of living. It is a human zoo on wheels. An outlaw whose normal day-to-day appearance is enough to disrupt traffic will appear on a run with his beard dyed green or bright red, his eyes hidden behind orange goggles, and a brass ring in his nose. Others wear capes and Apache headbands or oversized sunglasses and peaked Prussian helmets, earrings, Wehrmacht headgear, and German iron crosses are virtually a part of the uniform, like the grease-caked Levi's, the sleeveless vests, and all those fine tattoos: Mother, Dolly, Hitler, Jack the Ripper, swastikas, daggers, skulls, LSD, love, rape, and the inevitable Hells Angels insignia. Many wear other, more esoteric decorations, symbols, numbers, letters, and cryptic mottos. Others wear capes and Apache headbands or oversized sunglasses and peaked Prussian helmets, earrings, But few of these had any public meaning until the outlaws began talking to reporters. Among the first to be exposed was the numeral 13, indicating a marijuana smoker. This one is almost as common as the 1%er. Badge. Like the patch saying DFFL. Dope forever. Forever loaded. And the Playboy rabbit. Mocking birth control. Were exposed by True Magazine, which also explained the vari-colored pilot's wings, red wings, indicating that the wearer has committed cunnilingus on a menstruating woman. Black wings for the same act on a negress, and brown wings for buggery. California has laws against outraging the public decency, but for some reason they are rarely applied to the Hells Angels, whose very existence is a mockery of all public decency. When you walk into a place where people can see you, you want to look as repulsive and repugnant as possible, said one. We are complete social outcasts, outsiders against society, and that's the way we want to be. Anything good we laugh at. We're bastards to the world, and they're bastards to us. I don't really care if people think we're bad, said another. I think this is what really keeps us going. We fight society, and society fights us. It doesn't bother me. There are very few angels who won't go far out of their way to lay a bad jolt on the squares, preferably to the extent of unbalancing their metabolism and causing them to shriek in their sleep for days afterwards. But there is also a certain amount of humor involved. Funny Sonny once explained the angels' bizarre garb as a kind of joke, like a giant masquerade, which is true to some extent. But not everybody digs the angels' sense of humor, which can range all the way from belly laughs at Jackie Gleason jokes to quiet giggling at the sight of a man's face being shredded with a broken beer bottle. A weird haul at gang's hideout. San Diego, July 18th, UPI. 4 coffins, 2 grave markers, and Nazi emblems were found Saturday in the headquarters of a motorcycle gang, where 3 members were arrested on narcotics charges. The residence also contained a thrown chair 5 feet tall, a stuffed owl, an oriental beheading sword, and assorted motorcycle trophies, police said. I don't recall any laughter that morning at the El Adobe. Late arriving angels kept rolling in, and rather than go off on their own, they elected to stick with whatever crowd was available. Now and then somebody would do a wheel stand across the parking lot. Others squatted on the ground, making last-minute carburetor adjustments. And those with nothing else to do stood quietly beside their bikes, smoking cigarettes or sipping from one of the beer cans that were being passed around. Bill, the Joker's president, was deep in serious pondering over a road map with Dirty Ed, president of the Hayward Hells Angels. Hutch, the Joker's vice president and chief spokesman, stood next to my car with 2 angels and listened to the newscast. Man, those mothers up there are double shook, said one of the angels. I just hope they don't hide the broads. With certain knowledge that an emergency force of cops and dogs was waiting for them, a knowledge now reinforced by radio bulletins, had already made a difference in the makeup of the run. Many who would ordinarily take their old ladies had left the girls behind in case of a serious clash with the law. Getting locked up in a country town is bad enough if you're by yourself, but to have your wife or girlfriend locked up in the same jail, instead of back home to call lawyers and bondsmen, is a kind of double jeopardy that the angels have learned to avoid. When I found such perennial double packers as Sonny, Terry, Tinny, Tommy, and Zorro without their women, I realized the outlaws were expecting real trouble. But instead of trying to avoid it, as they often have in the past, this time they were determined to meet it head on. "It ain't that we're really so hot for Bass Lake," said Barger. "But with all this newspaper and radio stuff saying they're laying up for us up there, we can't back out. This is one run we're going to make, or they'll never give us any peace again. We don't want trouble, but by God, if it comes, there won't nobody be able to say we ducked out." This is the kind of talk that was making the rounds in the parking lot when the 8:30 radio alert led into the rock and roll song called "A World of Our Own." "We'll build a world of our own that no one else can share. All our sorrows we'll leave far behind us there." The song made the whole scene gel. So I sat there in the car, sipping coffee from an Army surplus canteen on a mean cold morning when all of us should have been home in bed. I tried to fit the lyrics to the scene I was a part of. At first, it seemed like just another teenage pipe dream with a good swinging beat. "And I know you will find there will be peace of mind when we live in a world of our own. A world of our own." And then, sweet Jesus, it dawned on me that I was right in the middle of it, with a gaggle of righteous dudes that no man could deny. Weird flotsam on the rising tide. Giant boppers, wild ones, motorcycle outlaws. I had a feeling that at any moment a director would appear, waving cards saying, "Cut!" or "Action!" The scene was too strange to be real. On a peaceful Saturday morning in Oakland, in front of a dumpy Turkish-looking bar, this weird hell broth of humanity had gathered, wearing labels saying Hell's Angels and Gypsy Jokers, and now they were anxious to shove off on their annual Independence Day picnic. A monster rally, too rotten for Hollywood. Crude parody of the crazy, cool, melodramatic scene that Brando had already made famous. Yet the action was certified by Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. It was at least that real. Grant Wood might have titled it American Modern. But there were no artists on hand, no photographers, no legamen for the New York press establishment. Here was the radio chattering crazily about the impending destruction of a California resort by an army of 500 motorcycle hoodlums, and not even a wire service stringer was there to get a first-hand report. As it turned out, the press was getting the story from the police by telephone, which seemed odd in light of all the advance publicity they had whipped up. Finally, the Joker president gave the word, and we thundered out of the parking lot. The lead bikes peeled off into the street, and the others followed, whooping and gunning their engines. But the noise died out almost instantly. By the time the formation turned onto the freeway, just a few blocks away, the riders were strung out 2 abreast in each lane, holding a steady 65 miles an hour. Everybody looked grim and purposeful. There was no talk at all between riders. Here's the man who doesn't have any identity, but tonight he has the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles Fire Department upset. He has the National Guard called out. Tonight he is somebody. Tonight he has an identity. Reverend G. Mansfield Collins, a Watts minister speaking in the wake of the 1965 riots. As the most reprehensible celebrities in years, it was inevitable that their trek to Bass Lake would draw large crowds of horrified burghers all along the route. In Tracy, a town of about 11,000 on US 50, people ran out of stores to get a better look. I was standing in an air-controlled liquor store buying beer when the outlaws rolled through town. Good God Almighty, said the clerk. He rushed to the door, throwing it open to let in a blast of noise and hot air from the street. He stood there for several minutes, with his hand on the arm of a customer who moved up beside him. All of downtown Tracy was silent except for the roar of a motorcycle engine. The outlaws passed slowly down the main street, as if in review, keeping a tight formation with no talk and strictly deadpan. Then, at the eastern city limit, they accelerated up to 65 and roared out of sight. In Modesto on US 99, in the Central Valley, there were crowds on the sidewalks and photographers at downtown intersections. Some of the photos later appeared on the Associated Press wire. Wonderful shots. Independence Day in California, with the natives taking to the hills, done up in the latest West Coast styles. While the main clusters of outlaws rolled in lawful splendor toward the destination, there were others, late-running stragglers and double-tough independents, who were hustling to catch up. Somewhere near the Manteca turnoff, a quartet of hangmen from El Cerrito came thundering past. They materialized out of traffic. In my rear-view mirror, I saw them coming before I heard the noise, and suddenly they were right next to the car, filling the sunshine peace of the morning with a roar that drowned out the radio. Traffic veered to the right as if to make room for a fire engine. In front of me was a station wagon with several children in the back. They pointed excitedly at the hoodlums as the hoodlums came past, almost close enough to reach out and touch. The whole line of traffic slowed down. The bikes went by so fast that some people probably thought they'd been buzzed by a low-flying crop duster, but that wouldn't have bothered anyone for more than an instant. What made the sudden appearance of the outlaws unnerving was the element of intrusion. The Central Valley is healthy, rich-looking farmland. There are hand-painted signs along the road advertising fresh corn, apples, and tomatoes for sale at wooden stands. In the fields, tractors moving slowly along the furrows, their drivers shielded from the sun by yellow umbrellas mounted above the seats. It is an atmosphere as congenial to crop-dusting airplanes as to horses and cattle, but not to outlaw motorcyclists. They seemed as out of place as a crowd of black Muslims at the Georgia State Fair. The sight of these refugees from big city saloon society running around loose in Norman Rockwell County was hard to accept. It was brazen, unnatural, and uppity. 11. We're not in it for the presence of the. Were it not for the presence of the unwashed and the half-educated, the formless, queer, and incomplete, the unreasonable and absurd, the infinite shapes of the delightful human tadpole, the horizon would not appear so wide a grin. Frank Moore Colby, Imaginary Obligations. The Hells Angels, as a group, are often willingly stupid, but they are not without savoir-faire, and their predilection for traveling in packs is a long way from being all showbiz. Nor is it entirely due to warps and defects in their collective personality. No doubt these are factors, but the main reason is purely pragmatic. If you want the cops to leave you alone, you have to shake them up, explains Barger. We make the scene with less than 15 bikes. If we make the scene with less than 15 bikes, they'll always bust us up. But if we show up with 100 or 200, they'll give us a goddamn escort. They'll show us a little respect. Cops are like anybody else. They don't want any more trouble than they think they can handle. This was obviously true at Bass Lake, which had already hosted one Hells Angels rally. In 1963, an occasion which resulted in the defiling of a local church. Because of this previous hurt to the community, coupled with a fear of disrupted tourist trade, the law enforcement agencies of Madera County decided to fight the Hells Angels with a new kind of stratagem. The district attorney, Everett L. Coffey, drew up a document, a legal restraining order, designed to keep the outlaws out of Madera County forever. Or at least, that was the general idea. Sometime around noon, it became apparent from the multitude of radio alarms that several large bands of Hells Angels were indeed headed for Bass Lake. Yet, there were other reports of communities in both northern and southern California still braced for invasion. This was because various elements of the press had managed to convince each other that there were actually 500 to 1,000 Hells Angels. So when only 200 showed up at Bass Lake, both the news media and the police felt certain the others would strike somewhere else. When a half dozen of the Frisco Angels appeared in Marin County, they were immediately surrounded and followed by sheriff's deputies, who knew they were only the vanguard of a whole army just over the rise. The sad truth was that Frenchie and a few of his box shop cohorts had canceled out on the main run, wanting to avoid trouble, and had decided to go off on their own for a peaceful weekend. As it turned out, they were harassed more severely than they would have been at Bass Lake. If the Angels needed evidence to support their strength in numbers policy, they got it on July 4th. The only outlaws who didn't get jerked around by the law were those who made the rally. The few splintered groups who went off by themselves were searched and ticketed from one end of the state to the other. Afterward, a careful count of Hells Angels sightings added up to less than 300, including all the rest of the clubs, where the other 700 outlaws spent the holiday is any man's guess. If Mr. Lynch knew, he wasn't talking. Somewhere near Modesto, about halfway between Oakland and Bass Lake, I heard on the radio that roadblocks were being set up to prevent the outlaws from entering the resort area. At the time, I was running slightly ahead of the Joker Angel convoy, but behind the main Angel contingent that had left the El Adobe before I arrived. I wanted to be on hand when they got to Bass Lake, for the newscasts left no doubt that a major riot was inevitable. There are two ways to get to Bass Lake from the freeway. US 99. I knew Angels would go south to Madeira and then take California 41, a wide, well-paved highway all the way into Yosemite. The other access route is about 50 miles shorter, but it is a maze of switch-offs and half-paved back roads through the mountains. It took off at Merced and climbed up to Tuttle, Planada, Mariposa, and Bootjack. According to the map, the last 20 miles appeared to be a gravel goat track. My car had been wheezing and shimmying all the way from San Francisco, but I swung left at Merced and floored it for a long roller coaster run through the foothills. Only two of the outlaws, both strays, made the mistake of taking the same route. I passed one. He was kneeling over a road map in an ancient gas station near Mormon Bar. The other, with a girl on the back, came wailing past me on the climb to Mariposa. The temperature at noon was 105 degrees, and the brown California hills looked ready to burst into flame at any moment. The only green in the landscape was the fringe of the scrub oaks looking down on the valley. People who claim to know say these naughty little trees exist in only two places, California and Jerusalem. In any case, they burn well, and if a fire gets started in the grass below, the main job of the standby fire crews is to keep it from reaching the oaks, which squat there in the dry wind like an army of nervous virgins, a firestorm waiting for a spark. I was laboring along behind a fire truck when the untracked outlaw came zooming past. He had apparently tired of the slow pace and whacked his hog down into second, whining it out until he got abreast of me and then crashing into third. The men in the fire crew stared as if a polar bear had just rushed across the road. The bike was gone in an instant, but the clang and blast of its gear changes hung on the wind like the sound of a jet passing over. And in that instant, the firemen caught a glimpse of the hairy rider, the swastika on the gas tank, and the girl on the back. A sight so unutterably strange to their mountain eyes that they could only gape at it. A few miles west of Mariposa, well into the mountains, I heard another radio bulletin. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club has arrived at Bass Lake, and members are reported trying to filter into the resort area. Authorities, armed with a court restraining order, are manning roadblocks in an effort to keep the motorcyclists out of the area during the long holiday weekend. If the roadblocks were strategically placed, they could prevent a rendezvous by cutting off access to public campsites in the national forest and forcing the outlaws to congregate in places where they would be certain, by the very nature of their gathering, to violate some county or municipal ordinance. A blockade at Oakhurst, just short of the national forest boundary, could have created a situation where the Angels could be arrested for either blocking the highway or moving off of it and trespassing on private property. With their little imagination, the roadblocks might have been gerrymandered to force one group of outlaws off to the south and another to the north. There was no lack of methods the authorities might have used to prevent a Hells Angels rally at Bass Lake. But it was the same old story. The police were expecting at least 500 savages coming in for a rumble. Roadblocks would detain them, but for how long? And what then? The idea that the Angels would ride 200 miles for a party and then be turned back by a roadblock 10 miles from their destination was obviously wishful thinking. There would surely be violence, a bloody clash on a major highway, with holiday traffic backed up for miles. The alternative was to let them pass, but that too was fraught with tragic possibilities. It was a certified conundrum, a ruddy challenge to the legal and social machinery of Madera County. At a gas station in Mariposa, I asked for directions to Bass Lake. The attendant, a boy of about 15, advised me solemnly to go elsewhere. The Hells Angels are going to tear the place up, he said. There's a story about them in Life magazine. Jesus, why would anybody want to go to Bass Lake? Bass Lake. Those guys are terrible. They'll burn the place down. I told him I was a karate master, and I wanted to be in on the action. As I left, he warned me to watch myself, and not take chances. The Hells Angels are worse than you think, he said. They'll run right down a shotgun barrel. The next stretch of road was like something from a Lewis and Clark diary. The car suffered so badly that I figured I would have to abandon it before the weekend was out and catch a ride back to San Francisco in one of the swastika trucks. I amused myself between creek crossings by telling the tape recorder how weird it was to be seeking out a gang of big city psychopaths in this kind of country. The road was not even numbered on the map. Now and then I would pass an abandoned log house or the remains of a gold panning rig. Except for the radio, I felt as remote from civilization as any lone poacher in the jagged Mission Range peaks of northern Montana. Somewhere around 2 in the afternoon, I reached the smooth pavement of Highway 41, just south of Bass Lake. I was flipping the radio dial for bulletins when I passed a hot dog stand and saw 2 outlaw bikes parked conspicuously beside the road. I made a U-turn, parked beside the bikes, and found Gut and Buzzard brooding over the restraining order. Buzzard, formerly of Purdue, is a Hells Angel straight out of Central Casting. He's a weird combination of menace, obscenity, elegance, and genuine distrust of everything that moves. He turns his back on photographers and thinks all journalists are agents of the main cop, who lives in a penthouse on the other side of some bottomless moat that no Hells Angel will ever cross except as a prisoner. And then only to have his hands chopped off as a lesson to the others. There's a beautiful consistency about Buzzard. He is a porcupine among men, with his with his quills always flared. If you want a new car with a raffle ticket bought in his name by some momentary girlfriend, he would recognize it at once as a trick to con him out of a license fee. He would denounce the girl as a hired slut, beat up the raffle sponsor, and trade off the car for 500 secanals, and a gold-handled cattle prod. I enjoy Buzzard, but I have never met anyone outside the Angels who thought he deserved anything better than 12 hours of the bastinado. One morning when Murray was doing his research for the Post article, I assured him it would be safe to go over to Barger's house in Oakland for an interview. Then I went back to sleep. Several hours later, the phone rang. It was Murray, yelling with rage. He'd been talking quietly with Barger, he said, when suddenly he was confronted by a wild-eyed psychotic who shook a knotty cane under his nose and shouted, "Who the fuck are you?" The assailant's description didn't fit any angel I'd ever met, so I called Sonny and asked what had happened. "Ah, hell, it was just Buzzard," he said with a laugh. "You know how he is." Indeed, anyone who has ever met Buzzard knows how he is. It took Murray several hours to calm down after his introduction, but weeks later, after lengthy reflection and a distance of 3,000 miles, he was still sufficiently affected by the incident to describe it like this. We talked affably enough for half an hour or so, and at one point Barger grinned and said, "Well, nobody never wrote nothing good about us, but then we ain't never done nothing good to write about." But the convivial atmosphere began to change noticeably when 4 or 5 other angels, including Tiny, the chapter's huge sergeant-at-arms, stopped by and joined in. One, a surly, black-bearded youth named Buzzard, was sporting a pork pipe, hat, and a cane he had picked up somewhere. He waved the cane about as he talked and jabbed it at me from time to time. I suddenly got the clear impression that he would have enjoyed using it on somebody. I was the only candidate in the room. I was certain Barger and the other angels weren't about to pick on me, but I knew if Buzzard began going to work with the cane, I wouldn't count on anyone stopping it before I got hurt. To resist would have been folly, because the angels' code would have been called for all of them to pitch in. Would have then called for all of them to pitch in for old Buzzard, and I would have been demolished. I sensed menace in the room, and as soon as I could manage it, without giving the impression that I was bolting, which might have been a fatal mistake, I said goodbye to Sonny and strolled out of the house. I quote Murray because he gives me a sense of balance. His perspective on the angels was very different from mine. Buzzard was the only one who really gave him a jolt. The others only made his flesh crawl. The fact of their existence was an insult to everything he considered decent. He may have been right, and in a way I hope he was, for it would add to the satisfaction, the sense of culture and old-world solidity that I got from agreeing with him now and then. Actually, Buzzard is not that dangerous. He has a keen, dramatic sense and a taste for weird props. The pork pie hat Murray referred to is an expensive straw Panama with a Madras band. They sell for about $18 at the best shop in San Juan and are worn by American businessmen all over the Caribbean. Buzzard's cane, which Murray saw as a cudgel of some kind, is an integral part of his uniform, his image. Next to Zorro, Buzzard is the Angels' fashion plate. Except for his colors and his neatly trimmed black beard, he looks almost collegiate. In his late 20s, he is tall, wiry, and articulate. During the daylight hours, he is easy enough to joke with, but at dusk he begins to eat seconal, which affects him in the same general way that a full moon affects a werewolf. His eyes glaze over. He snarls at the jukebox, pops his knuckles, and wanders around the premises in a mean funk. By midnight, he is a real hazard, a human lightning bolt looking for something to zap. My first encounter with Buzzard was at the hot dog stand just out of Bass Lake. He and Gut were sitting at a patio table, pondering the 5-page legal document they'd been handed moments earlier. "They have a roadblock down by Coarse Gold," said Gut. "Everybody who comes through gets one of these, and they take your picture when they give it to you." "That dirty son of a bitch," said Buzzard. "Who?" I asked. "Lynch, that bastard. This is his work. I'd like to get my hands on that cheap-ass punk." He suddenly shoved the document across the table. "Here, you read this. Can you tell me what it means?" "Hell no, you can't. Nobody can make sense of this shit." The thing was titled, "Order to show cause why preliminary injunction should not issue and temporary restraining order made." It named as plaintiff the people of the state of California, and as defendants John Doe's 1 through 500, Jane Does 1 through 500, individually and as associated under the name and style of Hell's Angels, or One Percenters, or Coffin Cheaters, or Satan Slaves, or Iron Horsemen, or Black and Blue, or Purple and Pink, or Red and Yellow, unincorporated associations. The intent of the order was clear, but the specific language was as vague and archaic as the list of defendants, which must have been taken from some yellow newspaper clipping dating from the late 50s. What it amounted to was a temporary injunction, applicable to anyone photographed in the act of receiving it from the police, against 1, violating any public law, statute, or ordinance, or committing any public nuisance; 2, any conduct which is indecent or offensive to the senses; or 3, carrying or possessing for the purpose or of using same as weapons any blackjack, slingshot, billy, sand club, sawed-off shotgun, metal knuckles, switchblade knives, tire chains, and firearms of any type. It cited as reason for the order the incident 2 years earlier at the little church in the Pines. Defendants were drunk and entered said church without authority and without permission, took permission of numerous choir robes, donned the same, and paraded on foot and by motorcycle in a lewd manner, using vile and obscene language. At said time and place, it was necessary for a deputy sheriff to threat said defenders in order to recover said robes. Page 2 of the document struck a plaintiff note, saying it is well known in the state of California that the members of these associations, by intimidation, assault, and other generally violent means, attempt to take over the area in which they congregate. That an outbreak of violence habitually attends such actions, that resulting injury is and possible loss of life to members of the public, that the only reasonably certain way for any individual to avoid this violence is to remain at home or to depart from the area in which members of defendant associations are present. To Buzzard's vast amusement, I couldn't explain what the document meant. Nor, several weeks later, could a San Francisco lawyer who tried to interpret it for me. As it turns out, the Madera County Police couldn't explain it either, but their roadside translation was relatively clear. At the first sign of trouble, everybody on a motorcycle would be clapped in jail and denied bond. Gut seemed more depressed than angry at this turn of events. Just because I have a beard, he muttered. They want to put me in jail. What's this country coming to? I was trying to think of an answer when a highway patrol car drove up within 10 feet of the car where we were sitting. I hastily wrapped the court order around the can of beer I was drinking. The 2 cops just sat there and stared at us, a shotgun mounted in front of them on the dashboard. A high-pitched dispatcher's voice crackled urgently from the radio telling of various Hells Angels movements. Arrest reported in Fresno. Large groups of Highway 99. Group of 20 stopped at a roadblock west of Bass Lake. I made a point of talking to my tape recorder, hoping the sight of it would keep them from shooting all 3 of us if the radio suddenly ordered them to take appropriate action. Gut slumped in his wooden chair, sipping an orange crush, and staring off at the sky. Buzzard seemed to quiver with rage, but he kept himself under control. The surface resemblance between the two was striking. Both tall, lean, dressed for the road, but neither looking particularly scraggy. Beards trimmed, medium long hair, and neither with any sign of weaponry or weird extras. Without the Hells Angels insignia, they wouldn't have attracted any more attention than a couple of touring hipsters from L.A. At that time, Gut was not technically a Hells Angel. Several years earlier, he had been one of the charter members of the Sacramento chapter, which, like the Frisco chapter, began with a distinctly bohemian flavor. Terry the Tramp was another charter member of the North Sac Angels. They had always got along well with Sacramento's beatnik element, and when the chapter moved to Oakland, they brought some of this influence with them. It didn't go over too well at the El Adobe. The original Oakland Angels were hard-ass brawlers, a purer strain, as it were. And they had never made contact with the jazz, poetry, and protest element of Berkeley and San Francisco. Because of this conflict in backgrounds, the sudden consolidation in Oakland of Angel refugees from Sacramento and Purdue had an unsettling effect on the whole scene. A wanderer, like most of the others, Gut had also been a member of the Purdue chapter, but now, at 27, he was having second thoughts about making another plunge. Membership doesn't transfer automatically. The fellowship does, and the assumption is always that a transient angel will eventually be absorbed into whatever chapter he chooses to ride with. But there is always a waiting period, just to make sure. In Gut's case, the trial period was a very mutual thing. He wanted to go back to college in the fall, he said. We already had here at a junior college down south. He wanted to be a commercial artist, and his sketchbook of motorcycle drawings showed a natural talent. I'm not so sure I want to join the Angels again, he said one night, but I hate to lose friends. Sometimes I think I'd like to drop the club and settle down to something different. But it's hard to tell the Angels that. A friend of Guts, a non-angel, predicted he'll join again. Hell, he doesn't know how not to. The three of us were still sitting there, talking aimlessly, when the patrol car suddenly jumped backward, made a tight circle in the parking lot, and zoomed off down the highway. I quickly finished my beer and was packing up the tape recorder when there was a tremendous sound all around us. Seconds later, a phalanx of motorcycles came roaring over the hill from the west. Both Gut and Buzzard rushed toward the highway, waving and shouting happily. The road was dense with bikes. The hot dog stand was on the crest of a hill above Bass Lake. It was the last geographic barrier between the Angels and their destination. The police, in their wisdom, had managed to pile up at least 100 bikes at the roadblock, where the restraining orders were ceremoniously handed out, and then released them all at once. So instead of arriving in quiet knots, the outlaws crested the hill in a great body, howling and hooting, waving bandanas, and presenting the citizens with a really terrifying spectacle. The discipline of the highway had broken down entirely. Now it was madness. The sight of Gut and Buzzard cheering beside the road caused little Jesus to fling his hands in the air and utter triumphant screams. His bike veered off to the right and nearly collided with Charger Charlie, the child molester. An angel I had never seen, came by an orange three-wheeler, kicking his feet straight out like a rodeo rider. Andy from Oakland, who has no driver's license, came by with his wife, sitting in front of him on the gas tank, ready to grab the handlebars at the first sight of the fuzz. The noise was like a landslide, or a wing of bombers passing over. Even knowing the Angels, I couldn't quite handle what I was seeing. It was like Genghis Khan, Morgan's Raiders, the Wild One, and the rape of Nanking all at once. Both Gut and Buzzard leaped on their bikes and roared off to join the pack. As I was getting into my car, another bike pulled into the lot. It was an outlaw BSA, a rare animal in this league, and on it was a stocky, tough-looking man in his late 30s with a $400 Nixon camera hanging on his neck, Don Moore, then a photographer for the Oakland Tribune. Except for the Nikon and the lack of colors, Moore looked like looked as grimy and menacing as any angel, Hell's Angel, and with good reason. He was a veteran motorcyclist who had been riding longer than most of the angels. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had developed at least one of his talents and gained some leverage in the world of squares and money, but he had never given up bikes. In Oakland, he wore a blue suit to work and drove a white Thunderbird. But when the Angels went out on a run, he joined them on his old Beezer. He wore boots, greasy Levi's, and a sleeveless denim vest, showing tattoos on both arms. He looked like a middleweight Rocky Marciano and talked the same way. We speculated briefly on the nature of the weekend, but by that time, the last of the bikes had gone over the hill, and we both wanted to catch up. I followed them down the winding road to Bass Lake, and we soon fell in with the tail of the caravan. The outlaws weren't exceeding the speed limit, but they were gearing down noisily and zooming forward abreast through the curves, yelling and waving at people beside the road, doing everything possible to inject the maximum degree of civic trauma into their arrival. If I had been a citizen of Bass Lake at the time, I would have gone home and loaded every gun I owned. 12. Everyone knows our horsemen are invincible. They fight because they're hungry. Our empire is surrounded by enemies. Our history is written in blood, not wine. Wine is what we drink to toast our victories. Anthony Quinn as Attila in the film Attila the Hun. Bass Lake is not really a town, but a resort area. A string of small settlements around a narrow picture postcard lake that is 7 miles long and less than a mile wide at any point. The post office is on the north side of the lake in a cluster of stores and buildings, all owned by a man named Williams. This was the Angels' rendezvous point. But the local sheriff, a giant of a man named Tiny Baxter, had decided to keep them out of this area by means of a second roadblock, about a half mile from the center of downtown. It was Baxter's decision, and he backed it with his 3 men, his 3-man force, and a half dozen local forest rangers. By the time I got there, the outlaws were stopped along both sides of the highway, and Barger was striding forth to meet Baxter. The sheriff explained to the Angel chieftain and his Praetorian guard that a spacious campsite had been carefully reserved for them up on the mountain above town, where they wouldn't be bothered. Baxter is 6'6" and built like a defensive end for the Baltimore Colts. Barger is barely 6 feet, but not one of his followers had the slightest doubt that he would swing on the sheriff if things suddenly came down to the hard nub. I don't think the sheriff doubted it either, and certainly I didn't. There is a steely, thoughtful quality about Barger, an instinctive restraint that leads outsiders to feel they can reason with him. But there is also a quiet menace, an egocentric fanaticism tempered by 8 years at the helm of a legion of outcasts who on that sweaty afternoon, were measuring the sheriff purely by his size, his weapon, and the handful of young rangers who backed him up. There was no question about who would win the initial encounter, but it was up to Barger to decide just what that victory would be worth. He decided to go up to the mountain, and his legion followed without question or bitterness. The ranger who pointed out the route made it sound like a 10-minute drive up a nearby dirt road. I watched the outlaw horde boom off in that direction, then talked for a while with the 2 rangers who stayed to man the roadblock. They seemed a little tense, but smiled when I asked if they were afraid the Hells Angels might take over the town. They had shotguns in the cab of their truck, but during the confrontation, the guns had remained out of sight. Both were in their early 20s, and they seemed very cool, considering the much-publicized threat that had just met and sidetracked. I chalked it up later to the influence of Tiny Baxter, the only cop I've ever seen put Sonny Barger on the defensive. It was about 3:30 p.m. when I started up the dirt road to the designated Angel campground. 30 minutes later, I was still following the motorcycle tracks of a fresh bulldozer cut that looked like something hacked out of a Philippine jungle. The angle was low gear all the way. It zigzagged like a deer trail, and the campsite itself was so high that when I finally arrived, it seemed that only a heavy ground fog lay between us and a clear view of Manhattan Island at the other end of the continent. There was no trace of water, and by this time the Angels had worked up a serious thirst. They had been shunted off to a parched meadow 9,000 or 10,000 feet up in the Sierras, and it was obviously a bum trip. They hadn't minded the climb, but now they felt deceived and they wanted to retaliate. The prevailing ugly mood was shared by Barger, who felt the sheriff had duped him. The campsite was fit only for camels and mountain goats. The view was excellent, but a camp without water on a California 4th of July is as useless as an empty beer can. I listened to the war talk and shouting for a while, then hustled down the mountain to call a Washington newspaper I was writing for at the time to say I was ready to send one of the great riot stories of the decade. On the way down the road I passed outlaw bikes coming the other way. They'd been stopped at the Bass Lake roadblock and pointed up to the campsite. The Frisco swastika truck came by in first gear, with 2 bikes in the back and a third trailing 20 feet behind at the end of a long rope in a cloud of dust. Its rider was hanging on criminally behind green goggles and a handkerchief tied over the nose and mouth. Following the truck was a red Plymouth that erupted with shouts and horn blasts as I passed. I stopped, not recognizing the car, and backed up. It was Larry, Pete, and Puff, the new president of the Frisco chapter. I hadn't seen them since the night of the meeting at the DePow. Pete, the drag racer, was working as a messenger in the city, and Larry was carving totem poles out of tree stumps in other Angels' front yards. They had broken down on the freeway near Modesto and been picked up by 3 pretty young girls who stopped to offer help. This was the Plymouth, and now the girls were part of the act. One was sitting on Pete's lap in the back seat, half undressed and smiling distractedly while I explained the problem of the campsite. They decided to push on, and I said I'd see them later in town, or somewhere, and at that point I thought it would probably be in jail. A very bad scene was building up. Soon the Angels would be coming down the mountain en masse, and in no mood for reasonable talk. In the Carolinas, they say, hill people are different from flatlands people, and as a native Kentuckian with more mountain than flatlands blood, I'm inclined to agree. This was one of the theories I'd been nursing, all the way from San Francisco. Unlike Potterville or Hollister, Bass Lake was a mountain community, and if the old Appalachian pattern held, the people would be much slower to anger or panic, but absolutely without reason or mercy, once the fat was in the fire. Like the Angels, they would tend to fall back in an emergency on their own native sense of justice, which bears only a primitive resemblance to anything written in law books. I thought the mountain types would be far more tolerant than the Angels' noisy showboating, but compared to their flatlands cousins, much quicker to retaliate in kind at the first evidence of physical insult or abuse. On the way down the mountain, I heard another modern newscast saying the Hells Angels were heading for Bass Lake and in big trouble. There was also mention of a Los Angeles detective who had shot one of the suspects, rounded up for questioning about the rape of his daughter the day before. The sight of the suspect being led through the hall of the police station was too much for the detective, who suddenly lost control and began firing point blank. The victim was said to be a Hells Angel, and a newspaper on sale in Bass Lake that afternoon were headlined, "Hells Angel Shot in Rape Case." The suspect, who survived, was a 21-year-old drifter. He was later absolved of any connection with either the Angels or the rape of the detective's daughter, who had been selling cookbooks door to door when she was lured into a house known to be frequented by dragsters and hot rod types. The detective admitted losing his head and shooting the wrong man. He later pleaded temporary insanity and was acquitted of all charges by a Los Angeles grand jury. It took several days, however, for the press to separate the rape shooting from the Hells Angels. And in the meantime, the headlines added fuel to the fire. On top of the Laconia stories, including the one in Life, the radio bulletins, and all the frightening predictions in the daily press. Now this, a Hells Angels rape in Los Angeles, and just in time for the July 3rd papers. Given all these fiery ingredients, I didn't feel a trace of alarmist guilt when I finally got a Bass Lake, Washington connection and began outlining what was about to happen. I was standing in a glass phone booth in downtown Bass Lake, which consists of a small post office, a big grocery, a bar and cocktail lounge, and several other picturesque redwood establishments that look very combustible. While I was talking, Don Moore pulled up on his bike, having breached the roadblock with his press credentials, and indicated that he was in a hurry to call the Tribune. My editor in Washington was telling me how and when to file, but I was not to do so until the riot was running under its own power, with significant hurt to both flesh and property. And then I was to send no more than an arty variation of the standard wire service news blurb: who, what, when, where, and why. I was still on the phone when I saw a big burr-haired lad with a pistol on his belt walk over to Moore and tell me to get out of town. Walk over to Moore and tell him to get out of town. I couldn't hear much of what was going on, but I saw Moore produce a packet of credentials, stringing them out like a card shark with a funny deck. I could see that he needed the phone, so I agreed with my men in Washington. The first things would always come first, and hung up. Moore immediately occupied the booth, leaving me to deal with the crowd that had gathered. Luckily, my garb was too bastard for definition. I was wearing Levi's Wellington boots from L.L. Bean in Maine, and a Montana sheepherder's jacket over a white tennis shirt. The burr-haired honcho asked me who I was. I gave him my card and asked why he had that big pistol on his belt. You know why, he said. The first one of these sons of bitches that gives me any lip, I'm going to shoot. I'm going to shoot right in the belly. That's the only language they'll understand. He nodded toward Moore in the phone booth, and there was nothing in his tone to make me think I was exempted. I could see that his pistol was a short-barreled Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, powerful enough to blow holes in Moore's BSA cylinder head, if necessary. But at arm's length, it hardly mattered. The gun was a killer at any range up to 100 yards, and far beyond that in the hands of a man who worked at it. He was wearing it in a police-type holster. On the belt, that held up his khaki pants, high on his right hip, and in an awkward position for getting at it quickly. But he was very conscious of having the gun, and I knew he was capable of raising bloody hell if he started waving it around. I asked him if he was a deputy sheriff. No, I'm working for Mr. Williams, he said, still studying my card. Then he looked up. What are you doing with this motorcycle crowd? I explained that I was only a journalist, trying to do an honest day's work. He nodded, still fondling my card. I said he could keep it, which seemed to please him. He dropped it in the pocket of his khaki shirt, then tucked his thumbs in his belt and asked me what I wanted to know. The tone of the question implied that I had about 60 seconds to get the story. I shrugged. Oh, I don't know. I just thought I'd look around a bit, maybe write a few things. He chuckled knowingly. Yeah? Well, you can write that. We're ready for 'em. We'll give 'em all they want. The dusty street was so crowded with tourists that I hadn't noticed the singular nature of the group that surrounded us. There weren't tourists at all. I was standing in the midst of about 100 vigilantes. There were 5 or 6 others wearing khaki shirts and pistols. At a glance, they looked like any bunch of country boys at any rustic hamlet in the Sierras. But as I looked around, I saw that many carried wooden clubs and others had hunting knives on their belts. They didn't seem mean, but they were obviously keyed up and ready to bust some heads. The merchant Williams had hired a few private gunmen to protect his lakefront investment. The rest were volunteer toughs who'd been waiting all day for a fight with a bunch of hairy city boys who wore chains for belts and stank of human grease. I remembered the mood of the angels up on that mountain, and I expected at any moment to hear the first of the bikes coming down the hill into town. The scene had all the makings of a King Hell brawl, and except for the pistols, it looked pretty even. Just then, the door of the phone booth opened behind me, and Moore stepped out. He looked curiously at the mob, then raised his camera and took a picture of them. He did it as casually as any press photographer covering an American Legion picnic. And then he straddled his bike, kicked it to life, and roared up the hill toward the roadblock. Burrhead seemed confused, and I took the opportunity to stroll off toward my car. Nobody said anything, and I didn't look back. But at any instant, I expected to be whacked on the kidneys with a big stick. Despite the press credentials, both Moore and I had been firmly identified with the outlaws. We were city boys, intruders, and under these circumstances, the only neutrals were the tourists, who were easily identifiable. On my way out of town, I wondered if anybody in Bass Lake might take one of my aspen leaf checks for a fluorescent Hawaiian beach suit and some stylish sandals. The scene of the roadblock was surprisingly peaceful. The bikes were again parked along the sides of the highway, and Barger was talking to the sheriff. With them was the chief forest ranger of the area, who was explaining cheerfully that another campsite had been set aside for the angels, Willow Cove, about 2 miles down the main road and right on the edge of the lake. It sounded too good to be true, but Barger signaled his people to follow the ranger's jeep and checked it out. The strange procession moved slowly down the highway, then veered into the pines on a narrow jeep trail that led to the campsite. There were no complaints this time. Willow Cove lacked only a 3-beer machine to make it perfect. A dozen of the angels leaped off their bikes and rushed into the lake, fully clothed. I parked under a tree and got out to look around. We were on a small peninsula, jutting into Bass Lake and cut off from the highway by a half-mile of pine forest. It was idyllic. It was an idyllic kind of setting and a very unlikely place to be put aside for an orgy. But it was, and the outlaws set about occupying it like a victorious army. Sheriff Baxter and the head ranger explained to Barger that there were only 2 conditions on their use of the site. that they would leave it as clean and unlittered as they found it, and that they would keep it to themselves and not menace the campgrounds on the other side of the lake, which were full of tourists. Sonny agreed, and the weekend's first crisis was over. The outlaw clan, which now numbered about 200, was agreeably settled in a private kingdom, with nothing of substance to bitch about. Beyond that, the Maximum Angel was committed to the task of keeping his people under control. It was an unnatural situation for Barger to find himself in. Instead of spending the weekend rallying his boozy legion from one piece of unfriendly turf to another, beset at all times by a cruel authority wearing guns and badges, he now found his people in a pleasant cul-de-sac, a state of rare equality with the rest of humanity, which they could only disturb by committing some deliberate outrage, by violating an agreement that the Prez had honored with his word. The transaction had been carried out in Hollywood Indian style. There was a childlike simplicity to the dialogue between Barger and the lawman. If you play straight with us, Sonny, we'll play straight with you. We don't want any trouble, and we know you guys have as much right to camp on this lake as anybody else. But the minute you cause trouble for us or anyone else, we're gonna come down on you hard. It's gonna be Powder Valley for your whole gang. Barger nods, seeming to understand. We didn't come here for trouble, Sheriff. The way we heard it, you had trouble waiting for us. Well, what did you expect? We heard you were coming in for a rumble to tear things up. Baxter forces a smile. But there's no reason why you can't enjoy yourself here like everybody else. You guys know what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with you. We know that. Then Barger smiles very faintly, but he smiles so seldom that even a grimace means he thinks something is very funny. Come off it, Sheriff. You know we're all fuck-ups, or we wouldn't be here. The sheriff shrugged and walked back to his car, but one of his deputies picked up the conversation, and Sue found himself telling 5 or 6 grinning angels what basically decent fellows they were. Barger went off to get a beer kitty going. He stood in the middle of the big clearing and called for donations. We had been there about half an hour, and by this time I'd suffered a fatal run of my own stock. Puff had spotted the cooler in my car. I hadn't planned to roll into camp and instantly dispose of my beer supply for the weekend, but under the circumstances, I had little choice. There was no hint of intimidation, but neither was there any question in anyone's mind that I'd brought the beer for any other purpose than to share it at this crucial bone-dry time. As it happened, I had barely enough money for gas back to San Francisco. Once my 2 cases were gone, I couldn't buy a single all weekend without cashing a check, and that was out of the question. Beyond that, I was, and might still be, the only journalist in the Angels had ever seen who didn't have an expense account. So I was a little worried at their reaction when I'd forced to plead poverty and start drinking out of the kitty. My own taste for the hops is very powerful, and I had no intention of spending a beerless weekend in the withering sun. In retrospect, this seems like a small point, but it didn't at the time. It was an ill-chosen moment to cast my bread on the waters. The suck tide was running. Somewhere in the cacophony of foaming and hissing that followed the discovery of my cache, I recall saying to nobody in particular, "All right, goddammit, this thing had better work both ways." But there was no reason to believe it would. At that stage of their infamy, the Angels equated all reporters with Time and Newsweek. Only a few of them knew me, and the others were not going to be happy when I began lurking around the beer supply, draining one can after another in a feverish effort to even the score. Many hours later, after the beer crisis had passed, I felt a little foolish for having worried. The outlaws gave it no thought. To them, it was just as natural for me to have their beer as for them to have mine. By the end of the weekend, I'd consumed 3 or 4 times as much as I brought with me. And even now, looking back on nearly a year of drinking with the Angels, I think I came out ahead. But that isn't the way they balance the books. Despite their swastika fetish, the fiscal relationship between angels is close to pure communism, from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. The timing and the spirit of the exchange are just as important as the volume. Much as they claim to admire the free enterprise system, they can't afford it among themselves. Their working ethic is more on the order of he who has shares. There's nothing verbal or dogmatic about it. They just couldn't make it any other way. But none of this was apparent that afternoon in Bass Lake as I watched my stock disappear. While Barger called for funds. Although Sheriff Baxter had left, 6 deputies had attached themselves to the camp on what appeared to be a permanent basis. I was talking to one of them when Barger joined us with a handful of money. The sheriff said that place by the post office will sell us all the beer we want, he said. Wait. I was talking to one of them when Barger joined us with a handful of money. The sheriff said that place by the post office will sell us all of the beer we want, he said. How about using your car? There's likely to be trouble if we take one of the trucks. I didn't mind, and the deputy said it was a succo idea. So we counted out the money on the hood of the car. It came to be at $120 in bills and roughly $15 in change. Then, to my astonishment, Sonny handed me the whole bundle and wished me well. Try to hustle, he said. Everybody's pretty thirsty. I insisted that somebody come with me to help me load the beer in the car. But my real reason for not wanting to go alone had nothing to do with loading problems. I knew all the outlaws lived in cities where the price of a 6-pack ranges from $79 to $125. But we were nowhere near a city, and I also knew from long experience that small stores in remote areas sometimes get their pricing policy from the Gouger's Handbook. Once, near the Utah-Nevada border, I had to pay $3 for a 6-pack. And if that was going to be the case at Bass Lake, I wanted a reliable witness, like Barger himself. At normal city prices, $130 to $5 would fetch about 30 cases of beer. But up in the Sierras, it would only cover 20, or maybe 15 if the merchants were putting up a solid front. The Angels were in no position to do any comparison shopping, and if they were about to be taught a harsh lesson in socioeconomics, I figured they'd be more receptive to the bad news if it came from one of their own people. There was also the fact that sending a penniless writer to get $135 worth of beer was, as Khrushchev said of Nixon, like sending a goat to tend the cabbage. I mentioned this on the way to town, after Sonny and Pete had agreed to come with me. You'd have come back with it, Sonny said. A person would have to be awful stupid to run off with our beer money, Pete laughed. Hell, we even know where you live. And Frenchie says you got a boss-looking old lady, too. He said it jokingly, but I noted that raping my wife was the first form of retaliation that came to his mind. Marcher, like the politician he is, hastened to change the subject. I read that article you wrote about us, he said. It was okay. My article had appeared a month or so earlier, and I remembered a night in my apartment when one of the Frisco Angels had said, with a beery smile, that if they didn't like what I wrote, they'd come over some night to kick down my door, throw gasoline into the hall, and then put a match to it. We were all in good spirits at the time, and I recall pointing to the loaded double-barreled shotgun on my wall and replying with a smile that I would croak at least 2 of them before they got away. But none of this violence had come to pass, so I assumed they either hadn't read the article or had managed to live with what it said. Nonetheless, I was leery of having it mentioned, and especially by Barger, whose opinions automatically become the Hells Angels' official line. I had written the piece with the idea that I would never again have any contact with the motorcycle outlaws, whom I'd referred to as losers, ignorant thugs, and mean hoodlums. None of these terms I looked forward to explaining while surrounded at a remote Sierra campsite by 200 boozing outlaws. "What are you doing now?" Barger asked. "Are you writing something else?" "Yeah," I said. "A book." He shrugged. "Well, we don't ask for nothing but the truth. Like I say, there's not much good you can write about us, but I don't see where that gives people the right to just make up stuff. All this bullshit. Hell, ain't the truth bad enough for 'em?" We were almost to Williams's store, and I suddenly remembered my burr-haired inquisitor with his high-powered language barrier. We made the turn at the bottom of the hill, and I parked the car as inconspicuously as possible about 30 yards from the store. According to the deputy at the campsite, the sale was already arranged. All we had to do was pay, load the beer, and leave. Sonny had the cash, and as far as I was concerned, I was just a chauffeur. The chauffeur. It took about 15 seconds to understand that something had boggled the plan. As we stepped out of the car, the vigilantes began moving toward us. It was very hot and quiet, and I could taste the dust that hung over the parking area. The Madera County paddy wagon was parked at the other end of the shopping center, with 2 cops in the front seat. The mob stopped short of the car and formed a bristling human wall on the boardwalk outside the store. Apparently, they hadn't been informed of the pending transaction. I opened the trunk of my car, thinking that Sonny and Pete would go in for the beer. If things got serious, I could jump into the trunk and lock it behind me, then kick out the back seat, drive away when it was all over, and drive away when it was all over. Neither angel made a move toward the store. Traffic had stopped, and the tourists were standing off at a safe distance, watching. The scene reeked of Hollywood, The Showdown, High Noon, Rio Bravo. But without cameras or background music, it didn't seem quite the same. After a long moment of silence, the burr-haired fellow took a few steps forward and shouted, "Better get your asses out of here. You don't have a chance." I walked over to talk with him, thinking to explain the beer agreement. I wasn't particularly opposed to the idea of a riot, but I didn't want it to happen then, with my car in the middle, and me a participant. It would have been ugly. 2 Hells Angels and a rider against 100 county toughs on a dusty street in the Sierras. Burrhead listened to my reasoning, then shook his head. "Mr. Williams changed his mind," he said. And then I heard Sonny's voice right behind me. "Well, fuck that! We can change our minds, too." He and Pete had walked out to join the argument, and now the vigilantes moved forward to support Burrhead, who didn't look at all worried. Well, I thought, here we go. The 2 cops in the paddy wagon hadn't moved. They were in no hurry to break the thing up. Getting beaten by a mob is a very frightening experience, like being caught in a bad surf. There is not much you can do except try to survive. It had happened to me twice, in New York and San Juan, and it came within seconds of happening again at Bass Lake. All that prevented it was the suspiciously timely arrival of Tiny Baxter. The crowd parted to make room for his big car with the flashing red light on top. "I thought I told you to stay out of town," he snapped. "We came for the beer," Sonny replied. Baxter shook his head. "No, Williams says he's running low. You gotta go over to the market on the other side of the lake. They have plenty." We left instantly. Like the first campsite, the first beer contact had all the signs of a calculated botch. Baxter may or may not have known what he was doing, but he did not. But if he did, he deserves credit for coming up with a subtle and ingenious strategy. He made a limited number of appearances during that weekend, but each one came at a critical moment, and he always arrived with a solution. After the fixing of the beer crisis, the Angels began to view him as a secret sympathizer, and by midnight of the first day, Barger had been made to feel almost personally responsible for the welfare of everybody in Bass Lake. Each time Baxter fixed something, he put the Angels more in his debt. The strange burden eventually ruined Barger's holiday. The vagaries of the restraining order and the numerous agreements he'd made with the sheriff caused him to worry constantly. One of his few pleasures was the knowledge that Baxter wasn't getting any sleep either. On the way around the lake, we speculated about what sort of mob might be waiting at the next store. "Those bastards were going to stop us," said Pete. "Yeah, and that would have been it," Sonny muttered. "That sheriff don't know how close he was to having a war on his hands." I didn't take his remark very seriously, but by the time the weekend was over, I knew he hadn't been kidding. If Barger had been stopped by a mob of locals, nothing short of a company of armed militia could have kept the main body of outlaws from swarming into town for vengeance. An attack on the Prez would have been bad enough, but under those circumstances, a police-planned beer run, it would have been evidence of the foulest treachery, a double cross, and the Angels would have done exactly what they all came to Bass Lake expecting to do. Most would have finished the weekend in jail or the hospital, but they were expecting that too. It would have been a good riot. But looking back, I no longer think the initial clash would have been evenly matched. Many of the vigilantes would have lost their taste for the fight the moment they realized that their opponents meant to inflict serious injury on anybody they could reach. Big Frank from Frisco, for instance, is a black belt in karate who goes into any fight with the idea of jerking people's eyeballs out of their sockets. It is a traditional karate move, and not difficult for anyone who knows what he's doing. Although it is not taught in self-defense classes for housewives, businessmen, and hot-tempered clerks who can't tolerate bullies kicking sand in their faces. The intent is to demoralize your opponent, not blind him. You don't really jerk out the eyeball, Big Frank explained. You just sort of spring it, so it pops out of the socket. It hurts so much that most guys just faint. Red-blooded American boys don't normally fight this way, nor do they swing heavy chains on people whose backs are turned. And when they find themselves in a brawl where things like this are happening, they have good reason to feel at a disadvantage. It is one thing to get punched in the nose, and quite another to have your eyeball sprung, or your teeth shattered with a wrench. So if there had been a full-strength fight that afternoon, the locals would have probably have been routed after the first clash. But it would have taken a while for the police to muster enough strength to prevail. And in the meantime, the outlaws would have wreaked all manner of destruction on the merchant Williams's property, breaking windows, looting beer coolers, and probably rifling some cash registers. A few would have been shot by Burhead and his crew, but most would have tried to flee at the first sign of serious police action. This would have led to wild chases and skirmishing, but Bass Lake is a long way from Angel Turf, and not many of them could have made it all the way home without being captured at roadblocks. Barger knew this, and he didn't want it to happen. But he also knew that it was not a sense of hospitality or concern for his social justice that had gotten a campsite. Tiny Baxter had a bomb on his hands, and he had to tread carefully to keep it from going off. This was Barger's leverage. The certainty that his people would behave like wild beasts if they were pushed too far. But it would last only as long as things stayed quiet. John Foster Dulles might have called it a balance of terror, a volatile standoff which neither side wanted to upset. Whether this was a just or desirable situation for a woodsy American community to find itself in is, again, pretty much beside the point. As weird and unreal as the Bass Lake confrontation might have sounded to radio listeners in New York or Chicago, nobody on the scene had any doubt about what they were seeing. Right or wrong, it was happening, and by the time the Angels were settled at Willow Cove, even the locally made restraining order was irrelevant. The outlaws simply had to be dealt with in terms of moment-to-moment reality. I hadn't planned to get physically involved, but after the narrow escape at Williams's store, I was so firmly identified with the Angels that I saw no point to trying to edge back to neutrality. Barger and Pete seemed to take me for granted. As we drove around the lake, they tried earnestly to explain the importance of the colors. Pete seemed puzzled that the question had ever come up. "Hell," he said. "That's what it's all about." The other market was in the center of the main tourist area, and when we got there, the crowd was so dense that the only place to park was between the gas pump and the side door. If trouble broke out, we'd be hopelessly pinned in. At a glance, the scene looked even worse than the one we'd just been rescued from. But this was a different crowd. They'd apparently been waiting for hours to see the Angels in action, and now as the two stepped out of the car, a murmur of gratification went up. These were not locals, but tourists, city people from the valley and the coast. The store was full of newspapers featuring the Hells Angels rape in Los Angeles, but nobody looked frightened. A curious crowd gathered as the outlaws bargained with the owner, a short, moon-faced man who kept saying, "Sure thing, boys, I'll take care of you." He was aggressively friendly, even to the point of putting his arm around Pete's grimy shoulders as they made their way to the beer vault. I bought a paper and went to the bar and lunch counter at the far end of the store. While I was there, the rape story I heard a little girl behind me while I was reading the rape story, I heard a little girl behind me ask, "Where are they, Mommy? You said we were going to see them." I turned to look at the child, a bandy-legged pixie, just getting her permanent teeth, and felt thankful once again that my only issue is male. I glanced at the mother and wondered. Felt thankful once again that my only issue is male. I glanced at the mother and wondered what strange grooves her mind had been fitted to in these wonderfully prosperous times. She was a downbeat 35. She was a downbeat 35 with short blonde hair and a sleeveless blouse only half tucked into her tight Bermuda shorts. It was a vivid Pepsi generation tableau on a hot California afternoon. A sag-bellied woman wearing St. Tropez sunglasses is hanging around a resort area market, trailing her grade school daughter and waiting in the midst of an eager crowd for the arrival of the Hoodlum Circus, as advertised by Light in Life. I remembered the previous spring when I was driving one night from San Francisco to Big Sur and heard a radio bulletin about a tidal wave due to strike the California coast around midnight. Shortly before 11, I got to Hot Springs Lodge, which sits on a cliff just above the ocean, and rushed inside to sound the alarm. It was a slow night, and the only people still awake were a half dozen locals sitting around a redwood table with some bottles of wine. They had already heard the warnings and were waiting for the thing to hit. A tidal wave was a sight worth waiting up for. That same night, according to anguished police reports, more than 10,000 people flocked to Ocean Beach in San Francisco, creating a night-long traffic jam on the coast highway. They too were curious, and if the wave had come up on schedule, most of them would have been killed. Luckily, it petered out somewhere between Honolulu and the West Coast. A crowd of about 50 people gathered to watch us load the beer. Several teenagers got up the nerve to help. A man wearing Madras shorts and black business socks kept asking Pete and Sonny to pose while he backed off for panoramic sequences with his home movie camera. Another man, also wearing Bermudas, sidled up to me and asked quietly, "Say, are you guys really Nazis?" "Not me," I said. "I'm Kiwanis." He nodded wisely, as if he had known all along. "Then what's all this stuff you read?" he asked. "You know, the stuff about swastikas." I called Sonny, who was showing our helpers how to stack the cases in the back seat. "Hey, this man wants to know if you're a Nazi." I expected him to laugh, but he didn't. He made the usual disclaimers regarding the swastikas and iron crosses. "They don't mean nothing. We buy that stuff in dime stores." But just about the time the man seemed satisfied that it was all a rude put-on, Barger unloaded one of those jarring ad-libs that have made him a favorite among Bay Area newsmen. "But there's a lot of that country we admire," he says, referring to pre-war Germany. "A lot about that country we admire. They had discipline. There was nothing chicken shit about them. They might not have had all the right ideas, but at least they respected their leaders, and they could depend on each other." The audience seemed to want to mull this over. In the meantime, I suggested we get back to Willow Cove. At any moment, I expected somebody to start yelling about Dachau, and then to see some furious Jew lay Barger out with a camp stool. But there was no sign of anything like that. The atmosphere was so congenial that we soon found ourselves back inside the store, eating hamburgers and sipping draft beer. I was beginning to feel almost relaxed when we heard motorcycles outside and saw the crowd surge toward the door. Seconds later, Skip from Richmond appeared, saying he'd waited as long as he could for the beer and had finally decided to seek it on his own. Several more angels arrived for the same reason, and the owners scurried around behind the bar, serving up the mugs with a nice enthusiasm. "Drink up, boys, and take it easy. I bet you're thirsty as hell after that long ride, eh? The man's attitude was very odd. As we left, he stood by the car and told us to come back real soon with the other fellas. Considering the circumstances, I listened closely for a telltale tilt of craziness in his voice. Maybe he's not even the owner, I thought. Maybe the owner had fled with his family to Nevada, leaving the village loony to mind the store and deal with the savages in his own way. Whoever he was, the eager little person had just sold 88 six-packs of beer at $1.50 each and guaranteed himself a booming trade for the rest of the weekend. Without spending a penny, he landed in the West Coast's top animal act, a surefire crowd pleaser that would put the traditional lakeside fireworks display in deep shade. All he had to worry about was the good possibility that the act might go haywire at any moment, destroying both the profits and the customers in a brutal eruption, which the next day's newspaper would describe as the rape of Bass Lake, fire and panic in mountain resort, cops battle Hell's Angels as residents flee. The locals seemed resigned to it, and it was no surprise to find them armed and surly. Nor was it strange to find the police unusually tense. This was the first major rally since Monterey, and the vast publicity surrounding it was a factor that neither the outlaws nor the police had ever had to contend with. Things like roadblocks and restraining orders were new problems for both sides. The idea of a carefully reserved campsite had been tried before, but it had never been effective except late at night, when the outlaws were not likely to move around anyway. The real shocker, however, was the beer situation. The Angels have always prided themselves on the one contribution they inevitably make to any community they visit. In spite of the terror they inspire, they leave many dollars in local taverns. Because of this, they found it unthinkable that anyone would refuse to sell them beer, and especially without fair warning, which would have caused them to bring a whole truckload from the city. But Bass Lake was a different scene. The locals had nearly a week to work themselves into a swivet, and by Saturday morning they were braced for the worst. Among the safety measures they were counting on was the knowledge that the hoodlums would be much less dangerous if denied large quantities of drink. This was evident to everyone concerned, even the beer sellers, and besides, it was going to be a bad money weekend anyway, since the rotten publicity would cause large numbers of vacationers to go elsewhere. What manner of man would bring his family to camp on a battleground, a place almost certainly to be invaded by an army of vicious rabble? The question still pertains, but it doesn't alter the fact that people came from all over California that weekend to enjoy the rustic pleasures of Bass Lake. When they were turned away from motels or regular campsites, they slept in roadside turnouts and dirty ravines. By Monday morning, the lakefront looked like the White House lawn after Andrew Jackson's inaugural ball. The crowd was abnormal, even for a big summer holiday. Californians are known to be enthusiastic outdoorsmen. In 1964, near Los Angeles, thousands of weekend campers had to be restrained by barriers for moving into an area that had just been gutted by a forest fire. When it was under control and the barriers were opened, the blackened campsite quickly filled to capacity. A reporter on the scene said the campers were pitching their tents among smoking stumps. One man who had brought his family explained that there was no place else to go, and we only have 2 days. As a pathetic comment, it made a pathetic kind of sense. But nothing that simple and tangible could explain the capacity crowd at Bass Lake. Anybody who really wanted to know part of the outlaws had plenty of time to find a safer vacation spot. Police reports of possible Hells Angels strikes had Bass Lake near the top of every list. So it must have been a giddy revelation for the Bass Lake Chamber of Commerce to discover that the Hells Angels' presence, far from being a plague, was in fact a great boon to the tourist trade. It is eerie to consider the meaning of it. If the Hells Angels draw standing room only, any half-hip Chamber of Commerce entertainment chairman should see the logical follow-up. Next year, bring in 2 fighting gangs from Watts and pit them against each other on one of the main beaches, with fireworks overhead while the local high school band plays Bolero, and they call the wind Maria. They call the wind Maria. Bolero, and they call the wind Maria. "13. That was the trouble with Potterville. They had 400 people downtown, watching 200 of us." Terry the Tramp.